I didn't hear the words until hours later, not because they were whispered, but because shame takes its time before it settles in. Lauren had said it in front of everyone, standing in the middle of our family's Sunday dinner. "She's not like us. She's unstable. It's embarrassing." She smiled when she said it, as if humiliation was just another side dish to be passed around the table. If you've ever been labeled something you didn't deserve, stay close. Subscribe to Revenge with Seren, because this story isn't about being loud. It's about what happens when silence turns into strength. No one defended me. Not my mother, who turned her head and sipped her wine like she hadn't heard. Not my father, who cleared his throat and changed the subject. And certainly not Lauren, who had spent the last 5 years reminding everyone that her job at the Justice Department made her the real daughter they raised. I had just graduated that week, with a dual degree in ethics and public policy from a university that didn't carry the family name. I hadn't walked the stage in San Diego because I knew no one would come. Instead, I boarded a last-minute flight home to Sacramento, hoping that maybe a quiet return would mean a soft landing. Instead, I got silence, until that sentence dropped. My fork didn't move after that. The music kept playing in the background, some instrumental jazz my father liked. The walls of our dining room never cracked, the chandelier never flickered, but something in me shifted. And this time, I didn't try to fix it. Later that night, I found a text on my phone. No greeting, just a link. The video loaded slowly. It was me, 2 years ago, spring break, laughing on a balcony. Nothing criminal, but deeply personal. It was filmed by someone I once trusted, someone I had told no more than once, and it had been shared online, circulated, used, and now it had landed in the hands of my sister. The next message came from Lauren. "You need to get ahead of this. I sent it to Dad. You'll thank me later." There was no, "Are you okay?" No, "How did this happen?" Just a reminder that she had moved first. The knock came at midnight. I opened the door to my father holding a manila envelope. "I don't know what kind of life you want," he said, "but it won't be under this roof." Inside the envelope was my diploma, folded once, like junk mail. On the floor beside him, a small duffel bag. My name, black markered on the tag. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the door. He just turned and walked away. My mother stood in the hallway behind him, her rosary clenched so tightly I could see the beads pressing into her palm. She said nothing, and in that moment I realized that silence wasn't absence, it was a weapon. No one told me to leave, but the locks were changed by morning. I spent the first night at a gas station near Citrus Heights. The cashier offered me free coffee after I paid for a single granola bar. He didn't ask where I was going. I appreciated that. By the end of the week, I was on a Greyhound headed north, Portland. I had a backpack, $92, and no plan, just a sentence in my head that I repeated like scripture. If I have to start over, I'll make sure they never get to define me again. That second night in Portland, I stayed at a shared hostel above a bakery. The sheets smelled like yeast and bleach. The ceiling fan clicked through the dark. I lay awake and opened a small red notebook I had carried since high school. Inside were years of memories, my sister's doodles, my mother's handwriting, a birthday list in my father's blocky print. I stared at the pages one by one, then took the book outside. Behind the building, near a trash bin, I set the notebook on fire. No ceremony, no drama, just a steady, hungry flame that turned history into ash. And I whispered, "Let this be the last time they get to write my story." By morning, I had chosen a new name, just initials, not to disappear, but to be untraceable, until I decided to be seen. Have you ever been cut out of your own family's picture, not with a fight, but with a smile and silence? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes the ones who vanish carry the strongest voice of all. Portland was wet in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the rain, it was the gray that soaked into everything, the bus benches, the stairwells, the conversations. I arrived on a Thursday, stepped into the drizzle with a duffel bag still damp from the night before, and looked around like someone trying to remember what breathing used to feel like. I stayed quiet that first week. I moved like background noise, Harmless, ignorable, polite. The only ID I gave anyone was the initials I had chosen, CR. Just enough to fill out paperwork, but not enough to be found. I took jobs that didn't ask questions. Morning shifts at a pancake diner near Kearns, afternoon hours scrubbing baseboards in a pediatric clinic, late-night temp work inputting patient files for a logistics vendor that forgot my name after each contract ended. No one looked closely. That was the gift of invisibility. It let you build without interruption. I rented a room in a crumbling sixplex with peeling paint and radiators that hissed like angry cats. My space was the size of a parking spot, but it was mine. The cracked mirror above the sink reflected someone I didn't know yet, tired, thin, haunted, but still standing. Every night I wrote, not full sentences, not stories, just fragments. Still here. Don't check their profiles. You're not the shame. I scribbled them into a journal in a made-up code I had invented as a child, a secret alphabet no one else could read. It was my way of bleeding without leaving stains. There were nights I barely slept. The weight of being forgotten has a way of keeping your chest from rising. But then something shifted, almost by accident. It happened during a graveyard shift at the clinic. A woman burst into the hallway, clutching a child and speaking only Spanish. Behind her, a uniformed officer was holding out a clipboard and barking, "Firma aquí, it's already processed." The woman didn't move. She didn't blink. She looked like she might collapse. I stepped between them. I still don't know why. "She's not signing that," I said, voice trembling but clear. The officer narrowed his eyes. "And who are you?" I looked him in the eye. "Her translator." That was a lie. I was just the cleaner. But I took the form anyway, scanning the lines like I knew what they meant. "These documents are outdated," I said, "and improperly served. She's not signing anything tonight." He paused, then muttered something about protocol and walked off. The woman sobbed quietly. She held her daughter tighter. I didn't ask for thanks. I just stood there until the hallway was quiet again. 3 days later, I was called into an office upstairs. I expected to be fired. Instead, a man in a soft blazer offered me coffee. His name was Rafael Delgado, director of Mosaic House, a nonprofit for undocumented families. He had heard what happened. The staff had told him. "You know most people don't intervene," he said. "I know," I replied. "Most people still have something to lose." He smiled at that. "We need someone like you. Not as a cleaner, as staff." It was the first time someone saw past the mop bucket. I nodded. That's how it started. I fetched coffee, ran errands, filed papers, but I watched. I listened. I took notes in my coded journal and read public policy books from the thrift store on Hawthorne. I learned how grant applications worked, how budgets got balanced, how neighborhood meetings were held in echoing gymnasiums with bad coffee and better intentions. I never used the word home. But when a woman I helped hugged me and whispered, "Gracias por quedarte," thank you for staying, I felt something in my chest unlock. Years passed that way. I earned a certificate in immigration law from an online program. I attended open city hearings on public safety and housing. I began drafting outreach proposals for Mosaic House and quietly became the person the team turned to when policies got murky. I kept to myself. Never posted online, never used my real last name. It wasn't about fear. It was about building something no one could take credit for but me. Sometimes I painted, late at night. One piece, a silhouette of a woman dissolving into shadow, hung behind the curtain in my room. No one ever asked about it. That felt right. But Portland has a way of finding you when you're not looking. At a community workshop one winter, a state senator came to speak about justice reform. I stood at the back, clipboard in hand, hoodie up. He was eloquent, passionate, but something he said made me flinch. "Real policy is built by those who've lived the consequence of silence," he declared. I looked around the room. People nodded, clapped, but no one looked back at me. I didn't want applause. I wanted armor. That night I went home and opened a fresh page in my journal. I wrote, "One day I'll make silence a policy issue." Not a threat, a goal. I didn't want revenge. I wanted structure. I wanted protection for people like the woman in the clinic hallway, for anyone who had ever been discredited not by law, but by blood. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just lost a family, I had gained a reason. By the time spring arrived, I had stopped flinching when people said my name wrong. Camera Cam R Miss R. I let it pass, not because I had grown numb, but because I had learned something more useful than being known. I had learned to build in the quiet without anyone watching. At Mosaic House, I started every morning restocking diapers and coffee stirrers. Some days I translated paperwork. Other days I listened to stories no one else had the time or heart to hear. I didn't cry when they told me about midnight raids, lost brothers, or missing husbands. I just stayed present. That, I had learned, was the kindest form of advocacy. In the evenings, I worked alone in the upstairs supply room, organizing donated hygiene kits and shelf-stable meals. No one bothered me there. It was the one place I could think clearly, surrounded by labels, order, and purpose. Outside that room, the world didn't know my name. Inside, I was building something no one could take from me. On weekends, I attended free policy workshops at the local community college. I sat in the back. I never raised my hand. But I took notes. I watched how language turned into law, how budgets became barriers, how systems buried people with perfect grammar. I watched and waited. And slowly, without making a sound, I started moving forward. One evening, Raphael, our program director, asked if I'd ever considered representing Mosaic House at a local coalition on immigrant protections. I hesitated, because stepping forward meant stepping into light, and light meant exposure, and exposure meant her. Lauren. Her voice still lived in the back of my memory, her tone always just polished enough to feel like a knife. She hadn't spoken to me since the night of that video, but I remembered exactly how she had said it. "She's unstable. It's embarrassing." That sentence had thrown me out of my own house, but now, in Portland, people were asking me to speak, not just for myself, but for others. That night, I opened my old journal and wrote just 5 words. She erased me. I wrote back. The next morning, I said yes. The first coalition meeting was nothing glamorous. A church basement, a pot of burnt coffee, a room full of folding chairs and policy aides scribbling notes. I sat in the corner, listening, silent, until someone asked how to protect undocumented workers during local inspections. And then, almost without thinking, I said, if fear keeps someone from reporting abuse, that's not order. That's control dressed in paperwork. The room paused. Then someone said, "Can you write that down for us?" That was the beginning. Over the next few months, I wrote policy briefs, translated outreach forms, revised housing clauses, and streamlined safety referrals. I did it without a title, without a nameplate, and without a single photo attached. But the work spoke loud enough. "Who's Cam R?" "She's the one who fixed the contract language." "She's the reason we got the funding renewed." They didn't know where I came from, only what I could do. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Then, one rainy Thursday, I passed a bookstore going out of business. Taped on the glass was a sign that read, "Everything must go, even the things that made you." I stood there longer than I meant to. That night, I painted. The same figure from before, a woman unraveling in the dark. But this time, I added a thin streak of gold running straight through her chest. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it looked like healing. The next week, Raphael called me again. "You've been invited to present at the state review panel," he said. "Just 5 minutes, about our coalition's impact." I didn't hesitate this time. I wrote my remarks in one sitting. I wore a navy blazer and clean jeans, no makeup, no jewelry. I stood behind a chipped podium in a room full of people who had never heard of my past and wouldn't find it on Google. When it was my turn, I stepped up, cleared my throat, and said, "Justice doesn't begin in courtrooms, it begins wherever someone has the courage to stay when it would be easier to disappear." After the panel, a policy advisor approached me. "You're good at this," he said. "You ever work in California?" I smiled. "Only in a different lifetime." He laughed and walked away, not realizing how close he had come to recognizing me. I stayed behind, folding my notes slowly. I thought about Lauren, my father, my mother's silence in the hallway, and for the first time, I didn't feel grief or rage, just air, clean, unburdened air. Some people call that revenge, but when your name becomes a weapon in someone else's mouth, choosing not to answer to it anymore, that's not revenge. That's how you take the power back, without ever raising your voice. The first time I saw my work quoted, it was in a city council memo, tucked in the appendix, unbolded, unannounced, adapted from model designed by CR policy architect Mosaic House. No one sent it to me. I found it by accident while preparing talking points for another housing coalition meeting. I read the line 3 times, blinking at the screen, unsure whether to feel proud or afraid, because it meant I had left a fingerprint, and fingerprints can be traced. Still, I didn't shrink from it. I leaned back in my chair, closed my laptop, and stared at the cracked ceiling of my apartment, letting that one sentence sink deeper than any apology I'd never received. Adapted from model designed by me. The next ripple came from a small community blog that ran a feature titled Policy by Ghostwriters, the Hidden Figures Behind Portland's Reform Movement. The journalist had cited my outreach work, my housing language, my anonymous grant proposals. He didn't name me, but I knew the shape of my own words. He ended the article with a quote I had once written on a shared document: "Real change doesn't knock, it builds its own door." I remembered that night clearly. I had typed that line in the silence between 2 panic attacks. My heater had stopped working. I was wearing 2 pairs of socks. I hadn't eaten all day, but I had written something that mattered. That was the moment I realized my story had already started outrunning me. But not all exposure feels like sunlight. Sometimes it feels like smoke creeping in under the door. 2 days after the article posted, I received an anonymous email. No subject, just a screenshot. It showed my full name, Ava Lucia Vargas, on an archived university transcript. No message, no threat, just that, like a match being struck in the dark. I closed the tab. I didn't panic, but I lit a candle. Not for fear, but for memory. Because I had once sworn in a Portland alley behind a bakery that if the past ever found me, I wouldn't run. I'd stand still and let it see what it lost. Later that week, Raphael asked me if I'd consider speaking at the Regional Housing Policy Summit in Salem. They want someone who understands the language behind the reform, someone who's lived the silence the system creates. I almost said no. I smiled politely, then left the office and walked 5 blocks in the cold before sitting down on a bench outside a closed florist's shop. I stayed there for over an hour, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wasn't sure if stepping forward would feel like power or betrayal, not of them, of myself, of the girl who once burned a notebook behind a hostel and said, "No more." I pulled out my journal, the same one with coded pages, and wrote, "Visibility is not a confession, it's a decision." Then I stood up and walked back. The summit was hosted in a sterile conference center with long halls and too much artificial lighting. The seats were filled with nonprofit directors, city planners, journalists. Nothing about the room was warm. Until I stepped behind the podium. I adjusted the mic and began, "I was erased from the family that raised me, so I built a legacy they can't rewrite." The silence that followed was full, not awkward. People leaned in, some began typing, others simply looked up. I spoke not as a victim, not even as a survivor. I spoke as someone who had turned silence into a framework, as someone who had found power in not being found. When I stepped off stage, the applause wasn't thunderous, but it was steady. It didn't ask for attention. It gave it. And that's when I saw him. In the back, standing, still, Miguel Vargas. He didn't raise a hand, didn't move forward, but I knew that stillness. I had grown up in its shadow. My heart didn't race. It slowed. I looked at him for 2 seconds longer than I meant to. Then I turned away. Later, in my hotel room, I sat by the window with a cup of black tea gone cold. The skyline looked washed in fog. Below, people were going home. Lights flicked on in windows, voices echoed in parking lots. A child laughed somewhere, and I whispered, not for him to hear but for myself, "You erased me from your story. So I wrote one where you never had the pen." It started with a headline, "Federal Prosecutor Under Investigation for Evidence Misconduct," and below it, "Lauren Vargas, Office of Immigration Review, Washington, D.C." The article was clinical, just the facts, a whistleblower, a misplaced file, a questionable transcript, but I didn't need to read between the lines. I knew exactly how this would unfold. The internet called it a scandal, but I called it familiar. For years, Lauren had played the golden daughter, sharp, polished, impeccably dressed in shades of moral superiority. She had always known how to stay one step ahead, until now. By the next morning, national outlets had picked up the story. By the end of the week, her name trended beside the word disbarment. I didn't feel satisfaction, only stillness. Because I knew the game, she had built her identity on being untouchable, and the higher she climbed, the more oxygen she stole from people like me. Then came the calls. Not to my phone directly, but to Mosaic House, to our general inbox, requests from press outlets, podcasts, legal watchdogs. Is CR related to Lauren Vargas? Does Ava Lucia Vargas still work under an alias in Portland? Was the whistleblower connected to Ava? The past wasn't just resurfacing, it was circling. Raphael called me into his office. "You don't owe anyone a response," he said gently. "But if you want to go off the record for a while, I'll support it." I shook my head. "I'm not running." He nodded. "Then be ready. If your story gets dragged into hers, you lose control of the narrative." That night, I walked home in the rain. No umbrella. Just my coat pulled tight around my shoulders, my hair stuck to my face, the streetlights blurred in my vision, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel it. Not grief, not rage, but sorrow. Because Lauren had once been the person who left notes in my locker, who braided my hair before school plays, who taught me how to speak without stuttering, and then she became the one who pressed send on an email that ended with my exile. I lit a candle on my nightstand, not to forgive her, just to stay grounded. 3 days later, I booked a flight. Not for a press tour, not for a confrontation, just to be present. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning in Sacramento's Federal District Courthouse. I arrived Sunday night, checked into a small business hotel off Arden Way, and walked the perimeter of the building twice before going to sleep. I didn't call my mother. I didn't tell Mosaic House. This wasn't about them. This was about witnessing. The courtroom was colder than I remembered. Neutral carpet, metal benches, 2 cameras perched on the back rail. Lauren sat at the front table, her hair tied back, her jaw tense. I sat in the back row, not hidden, but not spotlighted, just there. When the judge entered, I recognized her instantly, Justice Marianne Nolasco, the same woman who had once spoken at my policy conference in Oregon. She glanced toward the gallery, paused. Then, "Is that CR from Mosaic House?" It wasn't a command, just a question. Heads turned, cameras shifted. Lauren turned too. Our eyes met, for the first time in 10 years. And for once, I didn't look away. I didn't wave, I didn't flinch, I didn't offer comfort. I simply met her gaze like someone who had rebuilt everything they tried to destroy. The hearing continued, legal terms, evidence timelines, motion to admit. But the air in the room had changed, because I wasn't a ghost anymore. By the time I stepped out into the California sunlight, my phone had 12 missed calls. Not from the media, from my mother. My mother's first message was a voicemail. Her voice was tight with urgency, like she was trying to sound casual and failing. "Mija, I heard you were in town. I didn't know you'd be at the hearing. Can we talk? Just dinner, okay?" She didn't say Lauren's name. The second message came an hour later. "We're all going to be home around 6. I'm making arroz con pollo. You always liked that, remember?" I stared at the screen long after it dimmed. The same woman who hadn't called when I had nowhere to sleep, who had watched me leave with a duffel bag and lowered her eyes instead of her voice. Now she remembered what I liked for dinner? I didn't reply, but I went anyway. Not because I owed them, but because I wanted to see what silence looked like after it unraveled. The house looked the same from the outside. Same porch light, same chipped mailbox, same jasmine vines curling along the gate. But as I stepped inside, I noticed what had changed. The air felt heavy with performance. My father stood in the hallway in a freshly ironed shirt. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. Lauren was seated at the far end of the dining table, her posture perfect, her hands wrapped around a water glass she hadn't sipped from. "Camille," my mother said gently, gesturing toward the seat at the table. "My old seat. Please." I sat without a word. The table was set like it used to be on holidays. Cloth napkins, full service, wine glasses none of them drank from. It wasn't a meal, it was a staging. "We're glad you came," my father said. It was the first complete sentence he'd spoken to me in over a decade. My mother tried to fill the silence with nostalgia. "Remember when you used to draw on napkins before dinner?" she said brightly. "You'd doodle little stories with your fork in one hand and a crayon in the other." Lauren said nothing. Eventually, my father leaned forward and cleared his throat. "We read the article," he said. I waited. "You've built quite the reputation," he continued. "People listen to you. You've done, well..." It didn't sound like pride. It sounded like calculation. Then came the pivot. "Lauren's in trouble," he said flatly. "But you know that. You were there." I nodded once. He looked at my mother. She looked at Lauren. And finally, Lauren spoke. Her voice was steady. Lawyer steady. "I never thought it would go this far," she said. "I made a call under pressure. It wasn't personal." She didn't say what she had done, or to whom, or why, and she never said, "sorry." My mother reached out, her hand halfway across the table. "We were wondering," she said, "if you could make a statement. Not public, just a letter. Something for the review board. You don't even have to mention you're her sister." Just enough, I thought. Just enough to pull her back up, without ever pulling me in. I set my fork down. The sound was louder than I meant it to be. "If I weren't the person you're asking a favor from," I asked, "would I even be sitting at this table?" No one answered. I looked at Lauren. Her expression didn't break. But her eyes did. "I didn't come here to fix you," I said quietly. "I came here to see if you still believed I was disposable." The silence that followed was suffocating. My father looked away. My mother's hand withdrew, and Lauren finally whispered, "I don't." But it was too late for that sentence to matter. Because some wounds don't scream, they whisper. Every time someone says, "just let it go." I stood up. "I kept your name," I said, "because I earned it, but I built my life without you in it." I turned to leave. My mother's voice cracked behind me. "Camille, please, she's your sister." I paused at the door. "So was I said, "but that didn't seem to matter when you needed a scapegoat." Then I walked out. No shouting, no door slam, just the weight of a decade finally placed back where it belonged. Outside, the air was cooler than I remembered. I stood on the front porch, hands in my coat pockets, watching the light from the dining room windows flicker across the lawn. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clean. Like I had returned to the scene of the fire, not to burn anything else but to prove I had survived it. I did not cry on the drive home. Not from restraint, but because I had done that already. On the fire escape of my first New York apartment, in the restroom between interviews, in the back corner of the plane on my way to graduate school, after they told me I was being too dramatic for not forgiving Lauren. There was a difference between sadness and grief, and what I felt that night was neither. It was a kind of release. When I stepped into my apartment, quiet, clean, familiar, I didn't even take off my shoes. I walked to the desk in my study, opened the folder marked Everwell Foundation, and stared at the printout of the advisory board. There it was, Lauren C. Alvarez, Vice Chair, Public Relations, a position I had added 5 years ago. Not because she asked for it, not because she earned it, but because I was still trying to believe I came from a family where redemption was possible. That night, I opened the secure admin panel, typed in my credentials, hovered my cursor over the edit icon. Then I clicked remove. No announcement, no press release, just an internal update that would roll out in Monday's Digest. I didn't do it to punish her. I did it because someone had once told me that forgiveness doesn't mean you invite them back inside the house that they burned down. She still had her career, her titles, her polished voice, and the same circle of people who never knew what she did. But she would no longer have my name beside hers, not on anything I built with intention. It was strange how quiet justice sounded. No gavel, just a soft exhale. The next morning, I went to the farmer's market. I bought white lilies, Daniel's favorite, a bottle of apricot jam from a woman with silver braids and hands like my grandmother's. Then I sat in the cafe across the street and wrote a letter. It was not to Lauren. It was to myself. A list of truths I had once buried to keep the peace. You are allowed to remember what they did. You are not selfish for protecting your peace. You do not have to be what they call you. Silence can be strength, not surrender. You are not broken. You are rebuilding. I folded the letter and slipped it into my wallet, beside my driver's license and an old picture of me and Daniel at the lake. A man at the next table looked over and said, "You look like someone who's just decided something." I smiled. I did. I went home and lit a candle, not for grief, but for presence. Then I took out the last remaining object that tied me to my sister, a necklace she had given me the night before I left for college. Cheap silver, chipped stone, but once loaded with meaning. I placed it in a box, wrote a note that said only, "Return to sender," and left it at the post office that afternoon. Not to hurt her, but because some things don't need to be held on to, just to prove they once meant something. That night I got one last message, not from my parents, not from Lauren, but from Isla, my niece. It was a picture. A hand-drawn image of two girls standing under a tree. One had curly hair, the other had a long braid. Underneath, in big purple crayon letters, it said, "Auntie Ava and me, we tell the truth." I stared at it for a long time, then whispered aloud, "Yes, we do." Not because someone taught her that, but because someone showed her. I did not check my phone the next morning. Not because I was afraid, but because for the first time in years I didn't feel like I owed anyone my availability. I brewed coffee, sat on the floor with my dog, watered the jade plant that had somehow survived 3 apartment moves and 2 heartbreaks. Then I opened my laptop and reviewed the final draft of our spring initiative, one I had funded without asking my parents or Lauren or anyone with an opinion about how much was too much for underserved children. The Everwell Foundation would launch its new mentorship program next month, and this time I made sure of one thing: no honorary names, no blurred acknowledgments, just one clean header, built by those who weren't seen for those who still aren't. That line had come to me weeks ago while reading Isla's crayon drawing. I thought of how many times Lauren was praised for representation when she had only ever shown up to galas, not group homes. I remembered how my parents once told me that giving anonymously wasn't strategic. But I no longer needed them to understand what worth meant. I had seen the look on one teenage girl's face when she realized her mentor looked like her, and had made it. That was worth more than any board seat. I printed the final proposal, stapled the corners neatly, then stood at my window, watching the wind move through the still bare trees lining the park. April was like that. Half winter, half promise. Just like me. Still learning how to trust that growth doesn't need to be loud to be real. That afternoon, I met with the Foundation's program director. She paused while reviewing the materials and looked at me with something between gratitude and respect. "This is bold," she said. "Are you sure you don't want the Alvarez name on it?" I shook my head gently. I want the girls to see their own names here one day." She smiled. "Then this feels different. It's not just a project. It's personal." It was. Because healing, when done right, is never just for you. Later that evening, a delivery arrived. No card, just a white box tied in a navy ribbon. Inside was a vintage hardcover book, The Ethics of Silence. It was annotated, flagged, clearly read. The kind of book Lauren would send when trying to sound intellectual. But inside the front cover was one line, handwritten in neat blue ink. "I meant it, you know, about you being the strong one." No signature, no apology. Just that sentence, dropped like a stone in calm water. I closed the book, took a breath, then placed it on the shelf between Women Who Run with the Wolves and my favorite memoir, Heavy by Kisa Lehman. It could stay there, quiet, unread again. Some things didn't need to be reconciled, just recognized. That night, I walked to the nearby library steps where Daniel and I had our first kiss. I sat there until the streetlights blinked on, thinking not of what I'd lost, but what I was finally claiming. Not as Lauren's sister, not as my parents' daughter, not even as Daniel's widow, but as me, a woman who had stopped asking to be invited because she had built something worth entering. The message came from the attorney at precisely 8:01 a.m., not from Lauren, not from my parents, just a cold, sterile line of text from their legal representative. Per request, you are hereby removed from all joint trust provisions effective immediately. No further legal obligation is owed or assumed. I read it once, then again. Then I closed the email, not with panic, not even with anger. With relief. There was no door slamming, no echoing betrayal. It felt like walking out into open air after too long in a stuffy room. You cannot grieve what you've already surrendered, and I had surrendered my place in their version of a legacy the moment they asked me to erase Daniel. At 8:47 a.m., I poured 2 cups of coffee, one for me, one into Daniel's favorite mug, the one with the faded World's Okayest Dad lettering Isla had gifted him when she was 6. I placed it on the kitchen counter like I always did, even now. Not out of superstition, but remembrance. By 9:15, I was lacing Isla's shoes as she fidgeted by the door. "Mom, can we still do the picnic later?" "We can," I told her, brushing her hair from her eyes. "We still will." That simple sentence anchored me. By 10:05, I was seated across from a financial officer at Pacific Horizon Credit Union, signing the final paperwork to open the Daniel Alvarez Youth Empowerment Fund. No board of family names, no joint control, no legacy committee chaired by people who hadn't even shown up for his memorial. Just a fund created by a widow who still believed in her husband's values, and a daughter who would grow up hearing the real stories, not the ones edited for convenience. The banker hesitated before processing the final authorization. "Would you like to list a secondary contact or co-signer?" I smiled gently. "Number, I think we're finally in the right hands." By 11 o'clock, the fund was live, and by 12:12, the first article appeared. Local Memorial Fund launches $150,000 in grants for youth mentorship. No press conference, no ribbon cutting, just a small, meaningful press release sent directly to the teachers and nonprofits Daniel once worked with after coaching Little League. Within 30 minutes, I received emails, dozens of them. One from a woman in Glendale who ran a reading circle for boys with absent fathers. Another from a coach in Riverside who wanted to start a summer leadership program. A counselor in San Mateo who said she cried when she read the mission statement. That was the only validation I needed. By 2 p.m., Lauren's name appeared on my phone. I didn't answer. Instead, I watched the notification disappear, then reappear a minute later. "You really used his name? For this? Without us?" I didn't reply. I owed them nothing now. No explanation, no performance, no curated image of grief they could twist into a storyline. They wanted to write Daniel out. I had made sure the city would remember him long after their trust documents gathered dust. At 4 p.m., Isla and I laid a checkered blanket across the back lawn. She had packed grapes, peanut butter sandwiches, 2 juice boxes, and an entire sleeve of crackers. "Because Daddy always ate too many," she said. We didn't light candles. We didn't hold hands in silence. We told stories. She asked me if Daniel really once dyed his hair blue in college. Yes, I laughed, and it was supposed to be temporary. It wasn't. We talked until the sun began slipping behind the pine trees, and Isla leaned her head on my shoulder. "Do you think Daddy's proud of us?" she asked quietly. I didn't rush the answer. I looked at the lawn he mowed every Sunday, the blanket he once spilled wine on, the child he used to sing to sleep with the wrong lyrics on purpose. "Yes," I said, "I think he is." That evening, I washed dishes with the back door open, letting the night breeze roll in. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore, it felt earned. And somewhere between the rinse and the dry cycle, a memory drifted in. A Christmas Eve when my father had raised a glass and toasted Lauren for being the one who always carries the family. I had smiled politely then, told myself maybe I was imagining it. But I wasn't. They had always chosen her voice, her version, her victory. And for years I had let them. But not anymore. At 7:42 p.m., I opened the journal I had kept since the hospital, the one Daniel never saw. I wrote one sentence. She inherited the trust. I inherited the truth. And with that, I closed the book, because there was nothing else to prove. It was nearly midnight when I heard the soft ping of an email arriving. I wasn't waiting for anything. At least, that is what I told myself. But I checked anyway. It was from Lauren. Not a lawyer, not her assistant, just her, finally, unfiltered. Subject, family affairs. No greeting, no warmth. Just 5 sentences that somehow said both too much and nothing at all. "I saw what you did with the fund. I'm sure you think it's noble. But you had no right to use his name publicly. That legacy was meant to be private. We could have handled it together. Now you've made it a spectacle." I stared at it for a long time. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. That email was never about Daniel. It was about control, about narrative, about who gets to write the final chapter when the person at the center of it all is gone. For years, Lauren had been the keeper of appearances. She handled the holiday cards, the family announcements, even the flowers at Daniel's memorial, all arranged like centerpieces at a table she never meant for me to sit at. But this wasn't her table anymore. By 12:40 a.m., I drafted my response, not to argue, not to explain, just to close the loop. Daniel's legacy was never meant to be hidden. You chose privacy. I chose purpose. You took his name from the trust. I gave it back to the community. I won't be responding again. I didn't wait to see if she replied, because it wasn't about her anymore. The next morning, Isla tugged at the sleeve of my cardigan as I buttoned up her coat. "Mom," she whispered, "are we still a family?" Her voice trembled just enough to break me. I crouched to her level and held her face in my hands. "We're a new kind of family now," I said, "one that tells the truth." Isla nodded. "Then I'm okay." That afternoon, we walked together into the community center for the fund's first mentorship program, Meet and Greet. There were folding chairs and too much coffee and hand-painted posters that read things like, "Believe you belong and Daniel would be proud." And there, among the chatter of volunteers and nervous teens, something shifted. For the first time in months, I wasn't being looked through. I was being looked at, with respect, with clarity, with recognition. One woman approached me near the snack table and said, "You're his wife, aren't you?" I nodded. My son played soccer with him. He still talks about what Daniel told him. It's not about being the best, it's about being kind when it's hardest. That stuck. I bit my lip to hold back the tears. That sounds like him. "He left something behind," she said. "So did you." That night, I walked into the kitchen and finally opened the drawer Daniel had claimed as his junk sanctuary. There, beneath old receipts and half-dead batteries, I found a small manila envelope. In his handwriting, it simply read, "For C." Inside was a folded letter, dated 3 days before his collapse. "Camille, if you're reading this, I didn't get to say goodbye the way I wanted. I don't want my legacy to be an insurance claim or a will fight. I want it to be stories, laughter, backyard s'mores. I want you to build whatever you feel called to build. I trust you. I love you. You were always enough. I read it in silence. Then I read it aloud. And when I finished, Isla, who had been standing behind me without a word, wrapped her arms around my waist and said, "Mom, let's build something together." So we did. We started small. A weekly story circle for kids who didn't have a bedtime reader, then a bike drive, then a winter coat exchange, one brick at a time, not made of money, but meaning. We didn't send invitations to my parents, or to Lauren, because this time it wasn't about reconciliation, it was about restoration. I no longer needed to be written into someone else's story. I was writing our own. One evening, about a month later, I stood in the back of a local library where Isla had just given her first student speech at age 7. She spoke about Daniel, about what it means to miss someone and still move forward. She ended her speech with, "You can remember someone and still grow past the pain. My dad would want you to grow." The room was silent, then it rose in applause. And there, beneath that small-town spotlight, I realized they had tried to take everything, but they failed to take what mattered: our memory, our courage, our voice. It was late spring when the letter from the executor arrived. No one had spoken to me since the fundraiser went public. Not my parents, not Lauren, not even cousins who once shared Sunday pancakes under our roof. For a while I let the quiet sit. Silence has a way of sorting things out. But then, as if grief had expired on some unspoken schedule, they resurfaced. The letter was formal, almost sterile in tone. "This notice is to inform you of a scheduled family estate meeting to discuss remaining disbursements and associated property matters following the passing of Mr. Daniel Reed." I blinked. Property matters. Daniel had no surviving blood relatives apart from his sister. Our house had been left in trust, and the only property left was what we had built together through that fund, none of which was under contest. Unless someone had found something. A few days later, my mother called. She didn't begin with, "Hello." She began with, "We need to talk about the cabin." I stood at the sink, staring at the water running over my hands longer than necessary. The cabin had been a tucked-away memory, a small retreat Daniel and I bought together after Isla was born. 2 hours from the city, never updated, never flaunted, just a place where our souls caught their breath. "Camille," she continued, "you know your father paid for the down payment. It should be discussed fairly. Lauren wants to include it in the joint asset file." "Joint with whom?" I asked. "With the family," she replied, as if that clarified everything. I turned off the faucet. I didn't realize we were defining family by investment contributions. There was a long pause. Then, "Don't make this difficult." That was her go-to line whenever I was about to make things clear. So I did. "Mom, Daniel and I bought that cabin with the money we saved after selling his motorcycle. The only thing Dad paid for was a weekend fishing license and a few cans of paint." Another pause. "This isn't about money," she said. "It's about legacy." It always is. But whose legacy were they trying to claim? The day of the estate meeting, I arrived early. It was hosted at a boutique law office downtown. Polished wood floors, filtered sunlight, the faint scent of bergamot in the air. Too lovely for what was coming. Lauren walked in wearing pale gray and her old silver tennis bracelet, Daniel's last birthday gift to her before he fell ill. My parents followed, silent but watchful, eyes darting toward the hallway as if some hidden authority might rescue them. The attorney greeted us calmly. "We'll begin once all parties have signed the attendance sheet." I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I opened my bag and placed a folder on the table. Inside, deed transfers, Daniel's updated will, and a notarized statement I had prepared months ago, anticipating this moment. Because I knew they'd come. And I knew what they would try. Lauren glanced at the documents and paled. The attorney reviewed them, lips tightening into something unreadable. He flipped the final page, cleared his throat, and said, "Well, that does simplify things." My mother's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He looked directly at her. Mrs. Reed designated all properties, including the Pinebrook cabin, under an irrevocable trust. There are no remaining legal discussions to be had. This meeting, by default, is concluded. Silence. Then my father leaned forward, incredulous. "You mean we drove all the way here? For nothing?" The lawyer's response was precise. "For closure." As they stood, some in confusion, some in bitterness, I remained seated, not because I was trying to win, but because I had nothing to prove. Lauren lingered as the others filed out. She looked at me like someone seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face. "I never thought you'd go this far," she said. I met her eyes. "And I never thought you'd ask to share something you once said I didn't deserve." She nodded once, as if accepting the terms of a quiet farewell. And then she left. That evening, I sat on the porch of the Pine Brook cabin with Isla, watching fireflies light up the dusk like floating sparks of memory. She was reading from one of Daniel's old journals. I had let her pick which one to bring. It was from the first year after she was born, notes about fatherhood, sketches of trees, one sticky note that simply read, "Always let her lead." I hadn't opened that one in years. Isla closed the journal and leaned her head on my shoulder. "Are they gone for good now?" Her voice was small but not afraid. "Yes," I said, "and even if they come back, we don't have to let them in the same way." She nodded, wrapping her arms around her knees. "Dad's still here," she said softly. "He's everywhere." The stars blinked above us, as if in agreement, and I realized that this was the only inheritance that mattered, not cabins or documents or gestures of apology too late to be true. It was peace, the kind built not from what you hold on to, but from what you finally choose to let go. It was never supposed to be a grand event. The memorial service for Daniel was meant to be small, just a gathering at the community center where he used to volunteer on Saturday mornings. No formal speeches, no slideshow, just music, candles, and room for people to remember the quiet man who never asked for attention, but left deep footprints wherever he stood. But then Isla asked me the night before, "Can I say something for Dad?" I hesitated, not because I doubted her, but because I had no idea what a 10-year-old could hold that grown adults still refused to carry. We stayed up together, sitting on the floor with a notepad between us. She didn't need help, just silence and a mug of warm milk. In the morning, I packed everything without checking what she wrote. Letting go is often an act of faith. When we arrived, the center was already full. People Daniel had helped build ramps for, clients from the literacy program, a few kids from the soccer team he once coached, even the clerk from the hardware store he liked to joke with about the real cost of fatherhood. There were more people than I expected, and also some I hadn't. My parents were sitting in the third row. Next to them, Lauren. I didn't acknowledge them, not out of anger but clarity. You don't nod to a closed door. The service began. Quiet hymns, a poem from his former colleague, a soft photo loop on the screen, nothing staged, just the real moments, Daniel carrying Isla on his back, laughing while painting the porch, tying a kayak to the roof with too little rope and too much confidence. Then the program paused, and Isla stood. She walked to the front with small, deliberate steps, her white dress brushing against her ankles like she was stepping through water. She didn't look at the paper. She didn't need to. "My name is Isla, and I know most of you knew my dad better than I ever will, because I didn't get to have him for as long as I wanted, but I wanted to tell you who he was to me." There was a stillness in the room that even the air respected. He made up bedtime stories that always ended with me as the hero. He learned to braid my hair better than my mom. "Sorry, Mom." The room smiled. I did too. He told me that being kind was more important than being right, and that when people don't show up, I don't have to carry their absence as my fault. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't cry. She spoke like someone older than her years, shaped not by loss, but by understanding. So today, I want to remember him not with sadness, but with the promise that I will be someone he would be proud of, someone who shows up, even when it's hard. She looked at me then, eyes steady, then back at the crowd. "And to the people who didn't come when he needed them, or when we did, I forgive you, but I won't forget, because forgetting means you might do it to someone else, and I hope you never do." Silence. Then, soft clapping, followed by a wave of it. Lauren stood up and left first. My mother stayed seated, her hands folded, lips thin, as if the applause stung more than Isla's words. Afterward, a woman approached me, late 40s, leather notebook in hand. "Camille," she said gently, "I'm an attorney. Daniel hired me a few months before his passing to finalize something. He asked me not to speak until after the memorial." She handed me the envelope. I opened it that night, back at the cabin. It was an amendment to the original trust, a quiet addendum. Daniel had allocated an education endowment in Isla's name, but he'd also included a foundation clause to be activated only after Isla turned 18. The foundation would be called the Isla Project. Its purpose? To offer financial literacy and basic legal knowledge to young widows and single mothers navigating grief. And it would be funded by an additional policy Daniel had never mentioned, not even to me. I sat with that envelope on my lap, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Because that was Daniel. Preparing in silence, trusting timing more than thunder. A week later, the lawyer from the estate called again. Apparently, Lauren had tried to contest the cabin deed one final time, but when informed that the deed now fell under the Isla Project as its central retreat and community resource, she withdrew the filing. There was nothing else to say. Today, the Pine Brook cabin has a new sign at the gate, the Isla Project, headquarters and retreat center. We kept the inside mostly unchanged, wooden beams, the old fireplace, the soft couch that Daniel always swore he would replace but never did. But there are new voices now. Young women who arrive unsure. They leave not whole, but held. Isla helps me lead some of the workshops. She prepares snack trays with more care than a caterer, and she tells the guests, "This is where my dad used to sit when he was quiet, and it's okay if you want to sit quietly too." Sometimes they do. Sometimes that's the only thing they need. A few days ago, I received a handwritten letter from my mother. Inside, no apology, just a simple line. "We are sorry for missing what mattered. Please let us know if we can contribute to the foundation. Love, Mom." I didn't reply, not because I was angry, because some things don't need answers, just distance. And sometimes the most profound forgiveness is giving someone exactly what they gave you. A silent exit. Daniel once told me, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you leave within." And now I understand. I didn't just bury a husband, I built a future. What stays with me is not the revenge, but the silence she chose instead. This story was never about taking back what they tried to erase. It was about choosing peace over bitterness, love over legacy fights, and letting the next generation walk forward with dignity. Camille didn't scream, she didn't retaliate, she rebuilt. If you saw yourself in this story, hit subscribe to keep hearing kindness echo after heartbreak.